Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable devoted to the eradication of poverty. We've got some amazing people with us here up on stage, and we have some remotely. Let me introduce you to Najat BELKACEM. I don't know if she's with us yet. She's a former French minister here, and today she is responsible for the charity One here in France. You were also at the head of France Terre d'Asile, weren't you? We've also got with us Matthias LERIDON. Hello, welcome to you. Chair of the company Tilda and founder of an NGO. The name escapes me for the moment. You've been involved in ACTED, and your association now is called African Association for Development. We've got Habiba DJEBBARI, who is a professor here at Aix-Marseille University, helping me to moderate. And remotely, I'm saying hello to Sabina ALKIRE, who is at the head of the Oxford Poverty Lab at the University of Oxford. Good morning to you, madam. Or good afternoon, should I say. We also have with us Paul Collier, who's a professor of public policy and economics at University of Oxford, who has written an outstanding book about poverty in 2007, which is a reference book now. And we also have with us from Vietnam, Mr. Can Van Luc, who's the head economist at the Vietnam Investment Bank. Good afternoon to you, sir. I'm going to hand the floor immediately to Habiba DJEBBARI, who's going to paint the background to our conversation. We're not going to be able to exhaustively cover the subject today, but we're trying to give you a framework about poverty here in France. There are some figures which are very eloquent. There was a hike in poverty during the health crisis and around the globe also. Habiba, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to this session. Poverty means being hungry, being cold, feeling lonely, not being able to satisfy your essential needs. It's not having any health care, not a roof, no drinking water, not having access to basic health things. It means not being able to read or write, not having any access to information or to computing. It's not satisfying your basic needs. Being poor means never fulfilling your potential. Is it feasible to imagine we can eradicate poverty? To rise to this moral challenge in 1949, Truman said over half of the world's population is poor. For the first time in humanity, we have the knowledge and the expertise to relieve this suffering. Today, can we say that he was wise to believe in such a possibility? Since 1990, the number of people with under $1.90 per day has gone from 2 billion, which was 36% of the population, is now shifted to 630 billion, i.e. 8%. Such an increase had never been seen before. So yes, Mr. Truman was right. Yes, we do have the means. How did we manage? Well, let's take a closer look at the progress that was made between 1990. There were a lot of reduction has been in China. It has experienced the highest economic growth in the period. 680 million Chinese people are no longer poor. Economic growth has played a key role in this. In China, in the world, is this a necessary factor? Is it a sufficient factor? Reducing poverty isn't always positive. A lot of very rich countries with a lot of natural resources remain poor because other sectors of the economy are not growing. And because growth, federating growth, which strengthens the status quo, which fuels corruption, leads to waste. Getting back to China, their growth was fueled by opening up to the outside world, adding infrastructures, innovations too. These transformations are a reflection of public commitment by the authorities. But progress is always fragile. With COVID all around the world, poverty went up again after decades of dropping. Could we have avoided that? And above and beyond the COVID crisis, climate change, conflict, financial crisis are all major challenges which require innovations in our combat against poverty. So what can public policy do? It's highly likely that the countries which are rich in natural resources find it difficult to reduce their poverty, and those same countries will have the most disappointing results in terms of collective actions. These countries will not be able to draw up efficient policies or finance them or steer them to eliminate poverty. These are countries also which have been fragilized by conflict. China is counting on itself to finance social projects, and that gives them complete autonomy in terms of determining what they're going to do. In less developed countries, such actions are financed in part by funds from abroad. And these financing threads can be volatile and not very well organized. Some countries count on their own resources and define a real development strategy. Some countries in Latin America, Africa, are trying to strengthen their tax system. Others want to exploit revenue from the diaspora, which accounts for higher sums than international aid. So business leaders, researchers, government officials know all about their economy. They know the strengths and weaknesses. They can have legitimacy in working with other citizens to draw up a social contract which reflects the country. And they will find answers to past failures. Can we learn from China? Yes, we can, but let's not fall into the same trap of taking things overly into control. Over recent times, some countries have been able to get out of poverty, but now we need new tools to get rid of long-term poverty. My final comment is to talk about women and their ability to fulfill their potential. There are many limits. They're very clear for an American woman who cannot have an abortion, for a Nigerian woman who got married too young, and for the children that they will have, it will be very difficult to escape poverty. Those who can escape child marriage, those who can study, those who can work and provide the care that their children need, they have a different life. Eradicating poverty involves making women autonomous for themselves and for future generations. Thank you very much, Habiba DJEBBARI. We're going to try now to pick through the different questions which have already been submitted. I'm going to call upon Sabina ALKIRE to begin with. You are well known for your work on the multidimensionality of poverty. There's the Poverty Index, which dates back to 2010, which was taken into account by the United Nations. So we know how to identify poverty. We know how to target the poor. But how does that help us to find the resources better to define policies to eradicate poverty?
Thank you so much. As Habibi said, poverty has many different aspects. There's a monetary aspect for sure, not having the money to buy what you need. But then there are also these different kinds of deprivations that strike the same person at the same time. Lack of education or housing or work or health care, or even safety from different kinds of shocks. And these can be put together into a multidimensional measure that looks at the particular deprivation profile of overlapping, interlinked deprivations the same person or household experience at the same time. And that's important because this session is about eradicating poverty. So the first question is, what is success? And success is not having monetary poverty and also unraveling multidimensional poverty. So measuring both and using both as barometers of progress is important. As our late and beloved advisor, Sir Tony Atkinson, said in his last book on global poverty around the world, the important thing and the distinctive thing about poverty measurement for economists is that these measures have to be linked to action. So I'm very happy for this event and for making the links. I'll say 4 things. First of all, if we look at the data, it is possible to make strong progress and to eradicate multidimensional poverty. China has come up. The concept and measures of poverty that China used since 2012 have been multidimensional. But in a comparable measure that we do with UNDP for nearly 6 billion people, where 1.3 billion are poor, some countries have eradicated acute multidimensional poverty, like Serbia, Turkmenistan, North Macedonia, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia, all with data pre-pandemic from 2018 to 2020. And yet in other countries and subnational regions, it affects over 90% of the population, including in middle-income countries. But a couple points of good news to give examples. One is that of 80 countries covering 5 billion people, in 70 of them, there was statistically significant progress in at least one period that we cover in our database. And of the 20 fastest countries to reduce poverty in absolute terms, 14 were in sub-Saharan Africa and 3 in South Asia. So progress, including from the poorest countries, including low-income countries, is possible. Indeed, the fastest country to reduce multidimensional poverty was Sierra Leone, 2013 to 17, during the Ebola pandemic, when it came down from 74% to 58% of the population. The next fastest, Togo. The third fastest, Ethiopia, 2016 to 2019. So progress is possible. Is it possible at scale? In India, in a decade 2005-6 to 2015-16, 270 million poor people came out of poverty in a multidimensional measure. And furthermore, the poorest states, Bihar, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, had the fastest progress. The poorest groups by age of the children had the fastest progress. The poorest caste groups, scheduled tribes, scheduled caste, produced fastest, and the poorest religion, Muslim. So that was a catching up. So those are examples to energize, but they're all pre-pandemic. So what can be useful in this period is to use monetary and multidimensional poverty measures as tools to guide action. Interlinkages mean that multi-sectoral policies which share transport costs, which share the education of staff members, or which involve the private sector, can be very cost effective. And having a database that is interlinked at the level of the household provides a lot of information about packaging so that in the same fiscal resources, the impact on poverty is higher. And there are many examples of that we don't have time to go into. And that requires disaggregating, not only by rural, urban, but by subnational regions. We cover 1,300, by gender and intra-household. Of the 1.3 billion poor people, 836 live in a household where no woman has completed 6 years of schooling. And over 200 million live in a household where a man has, but a woman in that same household has not. So using this information is useful to guide policy. One has to remember volatility. We did a study in Europe using EU Silk data with Eurostat and the Net Silk 3 project using the longitudinal data. And we found that in a period of 4 years, that of the people who were poor, 60% of them were not always poor. And 25% of the population of the combined countries was poor in one of those 4 periods. So volatility post-COVID is a vital thing to track and change. And the last is to remember friends. NGOs, I'm glad that they are with us. Private sector are vital because they care about social bonds, the ESG. They care about their own workforce, some of whom may be poor, as well as their value chains. And engaging them with a common goalpost of the poverty we want to eradicate can accelerate the kinds of engagement that we're looking for. So others will talk about policies. Later we can talk about those policies, but being clear on what success means, and that pre-pandemic there were good moves in the right direction, I think is a good starting point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madame. Fera réagir.
We'll have to react. I guess we'll react later to Paul COLLIER. COLLIER.
I've got a very different message, and it's if I had to have one definition of poverty, I'd say
just 2 minutes.
But what I'm going to talk about is mass poverty. And by mass poverty, I mean that I'm getting an echo. If I cut off my.
On a un problème de connexion, on va peut-être changer les...
So we have a connection problem. So maybe we'll get back to him later. Well, sorry. Mr. Collier, je vais ask Mr. LERIDON. Maybe you could talk about your experience, which is more specific regarding this question of poverty, because you have a foundation. You told me exactly what it's like. It's with artists, and you also have your NGO CAP, who works operationally in terms of humanitarian issues. What is your view on poverty? Mrs. JEBBARI was saying, can you really eradicate this poverty? Do you have the feeling that it has changed, that it is, things have improved over the last 30 years? Well, first of all, it's presumptuous to talk about eradication of poverty in general. I think we have to start with some very simple elements. The period of pandemics was extremely positive on the production of carbon worldwide. It had the opposite effect on poverty. During the pandemic, for the first time for 30 years, poverty increased again. There was a reversal of the trend. Then, when we talk about poverty, you have to start from masses. So with three figures: 100 billion, €1, 100 billion people living with €1 a day. Alongside these people living with €1 per day, you have 1 billion people who are overweight, obese, 1 billion people who have access to 5G, and 100 billion is the number of refugees and those displaced people. When you put those figures side by side, you see that we have a situation regarding poverty today which has completely changed compared with 3 years ago. What I believe is that poverty is not only an economic issue. It's an economic prison, of course, for those who don't have enough for their daily life, but it's also a psychological prison. It's not enough to say we'll multiply by 3 or 4 the daily revenue of people living with €1 a day. You have to get them out of this psychological prison, a cultural prison, behavioral prison meaning that they no longer trust themselves and have no future, no hope. I would just like to speak very modestly through our Foundation African Artists for Development, which supports the development of revenue-generating activities. Someone who doesn't have a job can have an activity to get a minimum revenue. In refugee camps in Africa today, we have a situation where there's no more hope, because in most of these camps, it is the third generation living in the camp. Grandparents got there, they had children, and no one ever moved from the camp. When we talk about poverty, we're not talking only about an economic dimension. It's also the courage to get out of poverty, to have the personal, individual capacity to leave poverty. What I think is that you have to work on breaking down the bars of this psychological prison, as well as breaking down the economic equation of poverty. Something I would like to say. We had an idea with a number of choreographers At the time we worked it for the High Commissioner for Refugees, who is the General Secretary for the United Nations. We said that if we thought that if we go with choreographers to a refugee camp and create a choreography in a refugee camp, we will be able to get a number of people out of poverty. And they looked at us with a bit of a smile and think, I think these people live away from poverty. They don't have a clear vision of things. The reality is that when you go to a refugee camp, people have been there for 3 generations, and you say we're going to dance together, because we know that in the favelas, Rio de Janeiro, or in Africa, you get tired physically, and if you're tired, you're not so violent physically. And then you got those who dance well, those who can't dance, some who are not capable physically to be in the educational area. Some might have had polio and have now missing. But if you help them create something together with choreographer, there's kind of writing, so bit by bit, after a number of months, they are more confident. We are a highlight movement now with NHCR. We get people out of poverty not just by giving them money, but by creating new self-confidence so that they have the hope that they will be able to get out of poverty once, sometime. And it's because they have this personal reconstruction, all of a sudden they can go a different way from poverty. And once you've done that, there's another barrier. Our view on poverty, our view on exports. Until we have understood that the 1 billion people living with €1 a day worldwide are people who will be active for the humanity of tomorrow, active in a financial way, people who will be used to build the future. When you see that it is something just passive, you will never be able to eradicate poverty. Thank you for this hope. Najat BELKACEM was saying, the French director and ONG One, which battles extreme poverty. In the train, I was reading the Echo this morning, 71 million people went into poverty in 3 months' time, probably because of the Ukraine war added to the COVID crisis, which is far from finished, particularly not in the countries where vaccination is very limited. It's added to the climate crisis. How do you view this poverty? Do you think that we can still battle with multilateralism against this poverty? You've been in politics, you've been part of a government who believed in multilateralism. Do you think it's still possible to fight this constantly existing poverty, as we see with all these total figures? Oh, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. The introduction earlier was great about that, because I think it's good to start by reminding us that things have been possible over the years. It's good to remember that, as you said, since the 1990s, we had a downward slope in terms of poverty in a considerable way, and which is why we feel bad today because of COVID, or even before the Ukraine, to see the figures rising like this, 150 million more since the beginning of the COVID pandemic who have fallen into extreme poverty. This is the first time since the 1990s the figures have been on the rise. Once again, is it possible to fight extreme poverty and get the populations out of it? Yes, we have shown it was possible beyond poverty as such. They're saying poverty is multidimensional. And if we look into it, everything which characterizes it's not only food, there is a question of health. We're an NGO looking closely into questions of health, fighting tuberculosis, malaria, infancy mortality, and this infantile mortality was reduced during the decades that we talked about. And let me say it here, thanks to the existence of a World Fund set up. So the World Fund against AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, over a 20-year period, since 2020, it made it possible to avoid 44 million deaths because of AIDS, tuberculosis or malaria. So there are things which objectively are noticeable and should give us hope. And we realize when we do this work that we can't just ask countries to sort themselves out. Some were saying, I don't know, you or the lady, saying that there are some countries who are so deep in difficulty, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, a step is too high. You can't imagine that is with internal growth or private investment. As we were saying for China, that it can be solved. So we need international solidarity. And there can be several forms that either bilateral, a country like ours, deciding for so many reasons to support another country, or I must say more efficiently in multilateral ways, with coordination of the efforts from the wealthy countries, international institutions and world banks, because you have to talk about the World Bank, the IMF and so on, will provide answers as numerous as the problems. We have to see that with the COVID crisis, a number of economies of developed countries are in a difficult situations because they have to reimburse their debts, and this means that they cannot devote their limited public means to supporting health, education, or their population. So decide to relieve the debts of the poor countries cannot be a unilateral country taken by France on its own. It has to be a multilateral decision, and this could lead to results. I don't want to take too long, so I'll get back to this later, but I would come back to what Matthias was saying earlier, his question of figures 1,101 billion. We cannot expect everything from the public authorities. We as an NGO, we ask a lot of solidarity from wealthy countries towards the poor countries. But we understand that the money made available for poor countries is our collective money, which is also needed to support our public services in our country. We're seeing a rise in poverty in France as well. So at one point, we have the question of the contribution of the private sector. And so very quickly, we have other types of figures. We're going to mirror those of Matthias's. During the COVID pandemic, the fortune of billionaires has constantly gone up, while some were falling into extreme poverty. You had the 10 richest billionaires in the world. As a reminder, they each have about $100 billion each. This is the type of figure we're talking about. So the whole of their fortune going up by $3,600 billion during the COVID-19 crisis. The question of fair taxing on estates, fighting tax evasion, without wanting to get into polemics. I think the new era will be international solidarity if we want to be sustainable. Maybe a last word about what Matthias was saying about access to the poorest people. Let me tell you what happened to me in a refugee camp in Katmuna in Kenya, the largest one. To my great surprise, it wasn't art, it was sport. I realized at one point that there were football competitions organized. Kakuma is a camp with refugees coming from all the countries around Kenya. Many of them are in a situation of crisis, and so you had a lot of different populations. Football competitions were organized, and even we produced a kind of mercato with very limited means, a few coins that the refugees had. They all put it all in common because they had noticed a very good player in an opposite team, and they wanted that player. So So it shows that when you give them a possibility, we're all dreaming of the same thing. We also want to see this appetite for what is beautiful, for aesthetics, for sports, for everything which makes us a little more human. So I will say it again, you mustn't see the poor or the refugees as people who were characterized only because of their status. As a refugee I came across said, refugee is not my identity, it's a status, a temporary one, by definition, and I think the poor should be seen in the same way. Thank you for this feedback. I'll get back to Paul Collier. I think we've got Paul Collier back. We interrupted you, rather the technical problems interrupted you. So I have a question, Mr. Collier. You have worked a lot with world organizations. What is it? You're very critical about the efficiency of international aid, and we know that a number of the programs are based on the efficiency of international aid. Can you tell us about your view on it, which I think is quite a critical one?
You can hear me?
OK. Allez-y.
Go ahead. Can you go ahead? I can hear you.
So, I want to talk about the concept of mass poverty, which is a problem facing the poorest countries and the most fragile countries in the world. And it's a much less cheerful message than what we've heard so far. By mass poverty, I mean a situation where the average income, if you added up all the income and just looked at per capita income, everybody would be poor. So that even if you had completely equal distribution, everybody would be poor. And in such countries, you can't solve the poverty problem by targeted redistributions. The problem is that the average person is poor, and the reason they're poor is that despite often working very hard, they're very unproductive. So the real crisis of mass poverty is because people are not sufficiently productive. And so the challenge of lifting out of mass poverty is an economic process of investment and skills, and that's a very hard transformation. It's very hard. Most countries have now managed it or are managing it, but there are about 50 or so countries that haven't. A long time ago, I wrote this book, The Bottom Billion, which was the 60 slowest growing and poorest countries on Earth. And I've now updated all that information, and it tells a very bad story. Even before COVID, the poorest countries as a group were diverging quite rapidly from the rest of mankind. And in some, they were actually getting absolutely poorer. I opened The Bottom Billion with the example of the Central African Republic, and the Central African Republic now is undoubtedly in a much deeper economic crisis and political crisis than it was when I first went there a little over 20 years ago. And right across the Sahel, we see mass poverty as a problem. So what can be done about it? Well, the work so far by the World Bank and the IMF has just been completely inadequate. COVID has made it a lot worse, and the war in the Ukraine is making it even worse because there are now other priorities for developed countries, rather limited generosity. So this is just a nightmare of a problem. The starting point is to say, and some people have already said this, it has to be a domestically generated strategy to get out of the problem. The attempt to grow a country like the Central African Republic from Washington, whether from the IMF or the World Bank, or for that matter in New York in the UN, is just a completely non-starter. It's hopeless. These people don't have enough knowledge of context, and they're very inclined to think that they do. And so there are long lists of policy priorities imposed by IMF and the World Bank. IMF is now finally getting the message that that's not a good idea, because so many of its programs in poor and fragile states were failing. Something like 7 out of 8 were failing to achieve their objectives. So what we should do, yes, these countries need big resources. A good analogy is the vast resources that West Germany put into transforming East Germany. It took 30 years, it took vast amounts of money, but it worked. It's that sort of scale of effort that we now need to concentrate on the poorest countries on earth. The good news is that we don't need all of them to succeed at once. If we could get 3 or 4 of the Sahelian countries really to start succeeding, then the others would learn rapidly from that success. Within a network group, this is Joe Heinrich's stuff in evolutionary biology, within a network group, we learn fast. We don't learn fast across different network groups. So Latin America will have to learn from Latin America success. Africa will have to learn from African success. Central Asia will have to learn from some Central Asian success. So the vital thing was we put some resources where it looks to be a domestic leadership that is capable of having a strategy that looks reasonably sensible, and then they'll learn from their mistakes, they'll learn from their failures as well as their successes. But this has to be a process where domestic leaders try things and learn, not be told what to do by experts in Washington or New York, or for that matter in Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collier. On va terminer notre tour de table.
So we're going to finish our presentations with Mr. Can Van Luc, your head economist at the Bank for Investment and Development in Vietnam. I would just like to ask you about that strategy for eradicating poverty. Vietnam is undergoing a lot of economic growth.
Can you hear me?
Ma question, Monsieur Van Luc.
Yes,
You hear me?
Oui, on vous entend, on vous entend.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we hear you.
Inviting me to talk at this very wonderful forum. Within 5 minutes, I will try to focus on 5 main points. Okay. Number one, I will talk about how far Vietnam has been doing in terms of poverty reduction. So you may have heard about our economic reform in 1986. Basically, we were transforming from centrally managed economy into more market-oriented economy. And then since then up to now, every year Vietnam has been growing at about 6 to 7% per annum. And that's why our GDP per capita has increased from around $200 in 1990s up to now about 4,000 US dollars. And that's why you see the poverty rate by World Bank standard has reduced very much in Vietnam from 55% in 1990 to about 4.4% last year. So you may ask me a question, why Vietnam has been so successful in reducing poverty? Basically, Vietnam has been doing some things like number one, we were trying to identify the accurate causes of poverty, whether poverty is caused by by lack of education or lack of livelihood or difficulty in accessing jobs, so on and so forth. So the very first thing we need to do is to identify what are the major causes to poverty. And then Vietnam has been trying to resolve or to reduce poverty sustainability, okay, by number one, focusing on some priority areas. For example, we need to enable inclusive growth and private sector participation. We also need to invest into people and knowledge. We also need to ensure environmental sustainability and resilience. We also need to promote for good governance. At the same time, okay, we also have been trying to strengthen the private sector development and also the participation across different sectors. For example, NGO, international support, and so on. Okay, so what Vietnam is going to do in the next 5 years for poverty reduction? Okay, number one, we have set a very long-term target. Let's say by 2030, Vietnam should become a higher middle income country. Okay, so whereby we need to improve the quality and also the accessibility of education, especially higher education. We also need to improve labor productivity. Number two, we also need to improve the effectiveness of social assistance. And number three, we also need to mobilize different financial capital, for public investment needs and also for poverty reduction. And number four, we also need to reform our administrative procedures to make it more simple for the people to get access to different services, especially the community services. And next one, we also need to expand international cooperation, especially in mobilizing the knowledge and also TA, technical assistance and resources. Okay, so finally, what should be the international cooperation going in the coming future? I think international cooperation should be looking at number one, how we can cooperate to reduce poverty together. Okay, to avoid what we call inequality and waste. So I fully agree to Professor Paul Collier, our speaker some time ago, that we need to deepen international cooperation, but in a more effective way. Okay, by sharing good experiences like the agenda today, or by having some kind of similar network. We need to learn from each other, but the countries should be similar. Okay, and finally, we also need to mobilize different international aid without any political ties. That's also a very important point to touch upon. Okay, so having said that, I would like to conclude my talk here, and we look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Directeur.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to Najat, VALLAUD, BELKACEM, or Matthias LERIDON, if they want to come back on what they've just heard from those two other speakers about international efficacy. Yes, about what Mr. Van Look has just said about the experience in Vietnam. Well, I agree with Najat, who said, I agree that we're going to have to address this question of how wealth is shared out. And we are going to need some kind of tax system or a quota system. I prefer a voluntary system that translates into tax if there is no voluntary efforts. Each business and each individual can play a role in eradicating poverty. Do not imagine that it's a global system. I guess we need multilateralism, because without what we will not be able to saw away those bars from the windows of the prison of poverty. And the bars of this psychological prison, well, we can all take them down. We've seen that with tiny projects, which can have very, very big impacts. So we all have to wonder about how wealth is shared out. And all of these countries have to seek answers. If there's 1.4 billion Africans today, there's a quarter of that in Europe. The figures will triple in time, and we in Europe will be under 4 million. I think it's not possible just to live a few 10 kilometers away from each other without there being some kind of massive movement of cooperation, not leaving each country to find their own resources to get out of poverty. I think we have to invest in terms of human beings and economy and everything. We're not going to take any country's sovereignty away. We are just finding a way of working together on these subjects. The good news is that we all have a role to play. Out of the 18 poorest countries in the world, there are only 2 that are not African. So the 18 poorest countries in the world are all African apart from 2, and they're just a stone's throw from the European Union. Najat. Yes, to come back on what Paul Collier was saying, just because I'm at the head of an NGO and I advocate help, I'm aware of all the frustrations, the dissatisfactions that are around today. I agree when it's said that it's always more pertinent to carry out methods in the field with people from the field, with civil society, in the countries that are the poorest, rather than impose something which has been decided in New York or goodness knows where. So I completely agree with that. And I also agree with the fact that we have constantly to question our preconceptions about what's going on in the poor countries. The best thing is to have teams out in the field. For example, when we had COVID, I was really struck to see how the media reported on Africa. Apparently it was less impacted than the rest of the world because the population was so young, etc., whereas all of our players, all of our representatives in Africa were saying the exact opposite, that no, yes, we had a lot of trouble and there were no reliable systems for counting the people who had been contaminated, etc. So COVID was said to provoke 6 million around the world, but the true figure is more 15 million people, and this is the WHO giving that figure. And that's just to say that the situation is worse than we imagine. So it's also important not to make your judgment from your soapbox. You have got to get out in the field. I get the feeling that we've not got very much time left. I think there are subjects we haven't had time to brush upon yet. I'd like to come back to that convergence of the current crises. We talked about the war in Ukraine, the food crisis that's provoking. We've talked about the pandemic, but let's not forget the climate and the ecology crisis, whereby many countries today are suffering from drought. Let me give you some precise examples here. In Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, 1 person is dying every 50 seconds because of drought. That is the current situation. And once again, to cope with this convergence of crises, obviously, we're not going to be able to do as we have done in the past. And I think we are going to have to get the financial sector involved. That sector, I think, has a lot of room for maneuver in terms of taxing. They haven't been using all of those tools fully in Europe, for example, and our tax on financial transactions here in France isn't being as productive as it should have been, because those transactions which are the most fleeting are least impacted, and that's where all the problems lie. I do believe that the question of the private sector must be addressed, and there's another aspect of multilateralism. When you get the G7, the G20 meeting together, and when they take decisions, how do we make them answerable? So there's a lack of transparency. There are so many announcements made last week. Yeah, the last G7. Did you find it disappointing? Yes, of course I did. We get the feeling that there are all kinds of announcements that are made, hundreds of billions of dollars being made available. We don't know how it's constructed. It's like one of those Russian dolls with a smaller doll inside the bigger doll. And no one really is checking what has been done. Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, we had the IMF made this monetary creation. They're called these SDRs, special drawing rights, to help countries to cope with COVID. It was noted very quickly that the richer countries didn't really need them as much as the poorer ones. And so the former said that they would put 100 billion capacity at the availability to make it available to the poorer, and it still hasn't happened. So there are all these announcements, and they're not all followed through on. And what about extending the G7 to the G20 to address these questions, to enlarge multilateralism, to make it more effective? A final word from Matthias LERIDON, and then we'll have to wrap up. I'd like to come back on what Najat said. The G20 only has one African country, and that's South Africa. I think talking about eradicating poverty, you need to talk about transferring wealth from the wealthy countries to the poorer countries. If we do not have more countries that need help around the table, then it will be easy for us to imagine who's going to get to these rights, whereas it would be much better if you had some of these benefiting countries around the table. I would like to thank our participants who are with us remotely. It's always a bit frustrating. You can't always jump in and react to something which you hear. This is a very rich and wide subject. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Madame ALKIRE.